Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we are here on a new year and joined with David Kirkpatrick. How you doing?
Great. How are you doing?
Doing good. Ready to start out 2025 with another what-if scenario. A little bit of a dive into Kentucky's history, but potential of what could have been, what might have changed, and so forth. But we are looking forward to a whole new year of Kentucky history. Plenty lined up here in the coming weeks and months. Hope everybody had a good holiday break and, spend some time with the family and ready to get back at it.
That's right.
So we got us a pretty interesting topic, and for those of you who are big-time Kentucky history nerds, you are probably a little bit more connected to this if you're just more of an average Kentucky history person. Transylvania, not the college, not the place in Europe, but the Transylvania Company has a very interesting part in Kentucky history. But the question today is, what if Transylvania became a state? Which, if that was to be, that would change the course of Kentucky history and even probably the U.S. history in a massive way. So,
Absolutely.
where do we start with this, David?
Well, I think, like you said, to keep people acquainted with the subject, you have to kind of start with the history of the Transylvania Company, Richard Henderson and his background, and then where people sort of took it from there. Because, like you said, on the surface, it's like a simple thing. Kentucky has a different name. You move on. It's not a big deal. But it's really a lot more complicated than that the more you think about it, because of everything that's sort of swirling around in 1775. The United States is on the edge of revolution, and people, not just Americans, but also the British and the French and the Spanish, are trying to determine what to do with Central Europe. So, our Central America, what we would think of as the Midwest. And so it's an interesting subject. So from the beginning, Richard Henderson is the man, the myth and the legend, and in some people's point of view, the villain behind the story of the Transylvania Company. And, again, being in Harrodsburg, I'm obliged to say that it comes with the territory. But, Henderson's born in 1735 in Virginia. But his family, his mom and his dad, he had at least one sibling. They're only there for about a decade. And then they end up moving to Granville County, North Carolina. And that's sort of where he spends his teenage years and young adulthood. And he enters the profession of the law. So he reads the law and begins to practice. And of course, admittance to the bar was a lot easier back then. Abe Lincoln testified to that some. You had to read and be prepared, and then not quite as strenuous as it is today. But he makes it into the law profession and apparently is pretty good at it. He rises in his profession until 1768, when he's no longer a lawyer, but a judge on the Superior Court there in North Carolina. I don't know how their legal system works exactly, but I assume that's a state level court. Mm-hmm. And he seems like things are going pretty well for him, but it wouldn't last too terribly long, because at the age of 38, he retires. And I say that with some bitterness because I am 39 and a long way from retirement.
Me
but,
too.
It seemed to work for him. He retires in 1773, and he decides to go into the up-and-coming business of buying and selling land, which has always been popular in America, but especially at this point because the French and Indian War is over. Britain kind of controls not only Canada, but has um, undisputed control of the Ohio Valley. So areas both north of the Ohio River, like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and then areas south of the river, like Kentucky and Tennessee, are now strictly under the control of the British and, of course, the indigenous peoples that live there. So, just for a bit of context on that, Great Britain had banned the buying and selling of lands, though, in those areas. They were happy to claim it as belonging to the crown, but there was a real big concern about how the Indians would respond if settlement happens in Kentucky and places like that. They already had Pontiac's Rebellion after the French and Indian War. The British are extremely nervous. So they draw this line on a map, which, as we've talked about before, is sort of just the top of the Appalachian Mountains, and says no settlement beyond that. So this didn't really do much because colonial governments had their own reasons for wanting to settle. They negotiated their own treaties, and they really felt they had the legal right to go ahead and pursue lands in the West, especially in the Ohio Valley.
Yeah, yeah, and that's pretty much setting up the stage here because Henderson was really no different. He saw the value in the land in the West, and you know the U.S. population at this time had exploded in the sense that you had about 111,000 people in 1670 to over 2 million 100 years later in 1770. So that is a massive population boom for the area. And they would need homes when you kind of start thinking about as well the fact that tobacco had worn out the soil. So much in the east, people started looking to the west. It's an easy choice, and I know the proclamation was made, but you know, people aren't going to listen to that.
Yeah. The
um,
king's 3,000 miles away. So,
yeah, yeah. But Henderson was a man who liked to think big, and he had a very big vision. He was not interested in simple starting or starting a new town or a new homestead. Henderson wanted to start his own colony. And in August of 1774, he formed his own land speculation company, which, after a number of name changes, would come to be known as the Transylvania Company. And that is where we kind of begin this what if Transylvania became a state. Henderson's plan was simple. He would purchase most of what is now Kentucky and part of Tennessee from the Cherokee and would form his own colony, much the way that William Penn had ruled Pennsylvania. He would kind of come in, here's my colony, my settlement, and go from there. The purchase with the Indians was hotly debated by the Cherokee leaders. But in March of 1775, Henderson negotiated the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, and quickly set out setting up his new colony. And there was a very common name that led this party was old Daniel Boone.
I think I've
He
heard of him.
blazed the yeah he blazed the Wilderness Trail and founded Boonesboro. Henderson would call several meetings with the surrounding settlements to debate laws and settle problems. Um, he'd hope it would be eventually form a fully functioning government with legislature, governor, and judicial system. Um, but that didn't necessarily work out. And I'll say this too: at this time, when we say surrounding settlements, we're basically talking about two, three others.
Yeah, not many.
Harrodsburg, um, Boonesboro, and then um, you know St. Asaph, or what's Stanford, which what would become Stanford. Um, that's really about it. I mean, there's a few other stations, I guess, that are about to pop up. I'm trying to think of. There's a picture of a meeting with a hint of when that picture was um, dated, as in what it was depicting. But anyway,
Yeah,
um, but when Henderson's efforts seemed to challenge the rights of some settlers in a nearby Harrodsburg, uh, division broke out. Uh, Eventually, the Harrodsburg sent delegates to The Virginia legislature urging them to condemn Henderson's plan, and in June of 1776, Virginia prohibited Transylvania from exerting their power over other settlers in Kentucky. And then by December of 1778, their efforts had pretty much been void altogether. Um, it would take until 1783 for North Carolina to do the same, but Henderson's dreams had already evaporated in 1778. But, they did soften the blow. Henderson was given 200,000 acres in western Kentucky, and both the city and county of Henderson are named after Richard Henderson. So the Kentuckians have a little bit of a connection um, that came from the Transylvanians.
Absolutely. And not too shabby, 200,000 acres. I would take that.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, sorry, we ruined your colony. Here's 200,000 acres. Oh,
Yeah, so that you can sell off as you wish. So, but
yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. And but, to the question at hand, with Henderson, what would have happened, um, if he'd been successful? Again, like I said earlier, it's easy to think, well, it wouldn't be a big deal. The capital probably moves from Harrisburg to Boonesboro. The name changes to Transylvania from Kentucky. Other than that, what really is the difference? Um, but there's, on the one hand, if you're the governor of Virginia or North Carolina, and you see what Henderson's trying to do, it's easy to think that they might be very jealous and want that land back. But on the other hand, you got to defend these areas. The revolution's about to break out. You don't have much to spare to begin with. Maybe it's easier for them to think they're going to wash their hands of this area and just be done with it. And if Transylvania had problems, that would sort of be on them. So after all, just prior to that, well, actually, all through the Revolution, the North Carolinians fight what they call the Cherokee American Wars. So a number of skirmishes with the Cherokee to the west. And then in 1774, the Virginians, including the people living in Kentucky, fight in Lord Dunmore's War, which is a very small conflict where the folks in Kentucky are called back. The Battle of Point Pleasant happens in October of that year. So, if these sorts of battles and flare-ups and relations are going to become common because of the revolution, maybe having a buffer state between you and them is not a bad idea. So it's easy to see both points of view. But, if you're a Transylvanian, there's a problem. When you think about the logistics involved in settling Kentucky without the aid of a parent state, it goes from being hard to near impossible because Transylvanians are going to have to survive, and you can't defend your homes, you can't hunt, those sorts of things without guns and ammunition. And in 1776, Kentucky, as history played out currently, almost collapsed because of the lack of gunpowder. We know the story of how a party of folks from Harrodsburg, led by George Rogers Clark, well, originally just two people, George Rogers Clark, I want to say John Gabriel, that may not be correct, travel East Virginia and actually go to the governor's home, meet with him, and really explain how badly they need gunpowder in Boonesboro and Harrodsburg and places like that. And they get it sent down the river, and a delegation from Harrisburg goes up and gets it to the Ohio and brings it back. And because of that, the colonies in Kentucky, or the settlements in Kentucky, are able to live and fight another day. But if this area was its own colony, Henderson's going to have to find a way to arm these guys. And with a population of just a few hundred folks who are pretty much subsistence farming families, what are you going to tax them to buy gunpowder? I mean, that doesn't seem very likely.
Yeah.
You're not getting enough money to do anything. And you're not going to make it in Kentucky because it's the early 1800s before we realize the treasure that exists in Mammoth Cave. So for anybody who doesn't know, especially during the War of 1812 and that era, Kentucky is able to produce lots and lots of gunpowder because some of the key chemical components to bat guano or bat droppings, however you want to call it, really plays a big part in making gunpowder. And when you have the largest cave system in the world in Mammoth Cave,
Oh, wow.
you've got an almost inexhaustible source of the material you need. But in the 1770s, This is still not known to them. So the only way you're going to get that powder is from somewhere in the east. And we're all working together on the same team. It's possible that Virginia and North Carolina, if you're feeling generous, you're going to maybe send some supplies because you realize Transylvania is sort of guarding your western side. But that's really not terribly likely. They had very little to spare, and as we see from the sorts of supplies that were sent to the Continental Army, that was fighting in their own backyard, they were somewhat stingy with what they passed on. So it's very unlikely Transylvania would have gotten much in the way of donations. They wouldn't have had much money to buy it, and so they would have largely been out of luck. In that case, Henderson would probably have to do what James Harriet and those guys did in 1774. So we mentioned Lord Dunmore's War. You get called back to fight, but everyone has to evacuate east, for your own safety. And the assumption is land ownership is largely tied to improvements that you've made. So since you've built some cabins, you plowed a few fields, you're going back east with confidence that you have clear title to your land so that when this war is over, you can return. And we see a number of people do that anyway from Boonesboro in Kentucky and Harrodsburg. So, this may have worked out in their favor, but it could have also backfired because if there are no Kentucky forts to capture the Illinois territory and places like that, like George Rogers Clark does, he launches his attack from Kentucky and captures Vincennes and those areas and sort of gives the United States control of the upper Mississippi Valley. If there are no forts here to do that sort of thing, it's conceivable that the British would have asserted dominance over the region, and they may have reached a point where they say, fine, you can have your independence, but you have to remain east of the mountains, and we have the foothold in the Mississippi and lower Ohio valleys to make you do it. And if they had done that, American history is going to look pretty different when it comes to
Yeah.
westward expansion and those sorts of things.
Yeah, very much so. I'm going to throw up a little map here, and just so people can kind of see what we're talking about here, because you think, like you said, oh, this is no biggie. You have the Transylvania Purchase, and Kentucky becomes, or it's no biggie because Kentucky just becomes Transylvania, and nothing changes. But even when you look here at this map here, the Transylvania Purchase, it doesn't even cover all of Kentucky. It
Right.
is pretty much you got the Cumberland River in the south and the Ohio in the north, that it kind of goes along those areas, and then it doesn't really, I know the map cuts it off, but then it goes a little further, and that's it. But then you're looking at all of basically eastern Kentucky isn't even in, isn't even considered in the purchase. So if that, Transylvania becomes, let's say, a state or a colony, and then becomes a state, um, that reshapes literally the boundaries of the states and stuff going forward in American history. Reshapes Tennessee even. Um, and I would throw this out there too, that it kind of opens up this opportunity. So let's just say in this scenario, Transylvania becomes a state, becomes a colony, then becomes a state. Um, it kind of leaves this open that, like, anybody can run out here and in the West, and if they can settle a place, get a government running, have a colony, and have a state within, you know, really quickly, and then like you were talking about with Virginia having to fund, supplies and so forth, it becomes a very big, complicated situation if somebody's popping up a state here, popping up a state there, and on and on. That's going to make things complicated. Um,
Yes.
and and I look here too at this, Transylvania Purchase part of it. If you look at Boonesboro right here, I would assume that's probably where they were thinking their little capital would be, but it's right there on the on the Kentucky River. Um, it didn't sound like the best plan, but I don't know. Maybe they would have picked Harrodsburg or someplace a bit more central if that was going to become an entire state.
Right.
I don't know. But yeah, I think that the map's pretty interesting too. It just leaves out the whole northeastern part of Kentucky. So it would change things for sure. Um, Uh, so,
Absolutely.
what else could have changed?
Well, this is sort of a radical alternative, and I hope the people in Boonesboro will forgive me for this. When you're thinking of the worst case scenarios, you know, one of the things Henderson could have considered was changing sides during the Revolution. And, you know, I know it sounds bizarre to us because here on this side of history, we know how things play out. It seems like everything is inevitable. But if you really put yourself in their shoes, um, you know, having the British as allies just for your own survival would come in handy. For one thing, the British have the ability to order native tribes to stand down and not attack you. And they could have sent powder and weapons down from Detroit. We know they're already arming Indians in the Ohio Valley that way. So, you know, it's conceivable that supplies could have reached them. And,
Mhm,
you know, it's it's of course possible that the British themselves would have told Henderson, "Yeah, if you're really loyal, you'll go back across the mountains, like we told you to. You know, close up shop." We when we said no settlements in the West, we meant no settlements in the West, and that's that. You know, I mean, after all, the Proclamation of 1763, at least on paper, is still in effect, right? No one should be settling in those areas. So if the British are really going to follow their own laws, you know, that's certainly an option. Um, but you know, desperate times call for desperate measures, and the British are going to do whatever they need to do to win. And I think you sort of get a glimpse of that in 1774 because the British passed the Quebec Act, which basically extends the authority of the governor in Quebec all the way down into Illinois and those territories in northern Indiana. And the purpose of that is so they could really control the area a little better. So, for example, the French had a fort there called Vincennes. The British had taken it after the American Revolution, or during the American Revolution, rather, and then after the war had kind of let it fall. Let me back up, get ahead of myself. They took it during the French and Indian War, and then they sort of let it fall apart after the war. But when the revolution is heating up, the British reoccupy it. They rename it Fort Sackville, and they're determined to man it and defend it. And you know, George Rogers Clark ultimately ends up taking it, like we mentioned earlier. But the fact that the British were willing to establish this fort that had already been unmanned, already left to decay for 10 years in the heart of Indian Territory lets you know they really like the idea of fortifying places in the West, especially strategic places like that, so they could hem the Americans in and use it as a place to arm Native allies. So, you know, it's entirely possible they would have welcomed Henderson into the fold and sent supplies and men either south from Detroit or even possibly up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. So if this was the case, the United States would have had two options. You either have to subdue Henderson immediately before reinforcements can get there, or now you face a war on two sides. So it could simply be a scenario where Henderson gets to pick from the highest bidder. And you know, a lot of these guys we think of certainly are patriots, and we're not in any way besmirching them. But you know, early on in the war, there are these debates that we see in uh, primary sources where they have to decide, you know, who are we going to support? And, you know, if you are going to support independence, maybe you do have to go back east because
mhm.
if you're a standalone colony in the West, it's a death sentence.
Yeah, yeah, and it is a radical point, but, like, I hadn't thought of it, and that it makes a lot I mean, that could have very well, happened, and, you know, if you're the US and, um, you know, you're fighting, Britain and so forth, and then Britain kind of supports this colony that's sprouted up and, you know over in the wilderness, it might be one of those things too that like, well, let's just forget about that. We got to fight this war and move on, and that could allow Henderson as well to build, get more of a station, or a standing in the area, and then all of a sudden you have this other colony. But then does that would it eventually become its own country to say? You know,
Right.
would it stick around with Britain throughout the time? Because I mean, the whole point with the colonies were they all were, for the most part, British controlled until they decided, we don't want to be British controlled anymore. Um, Eventually, that would be could be the same thing happening in Transylvania. Um, as well, if that was to be the if it could have gone that way, I guess. Um, but it is very interesting because you could very well see if it started going one way, um, Henderson being like, "Hey, let's go with this." But I almost think too, and I didn't think about this until you brought it up, when the Harrodsburg people went over there and said, "Hey, we need to shut this down." That could have been a thing. Is that what if Henderson joins with the British or something? Let's go ahead and shut this down, make our claim, and take our claim, I guess, in that sense as well.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, that's sort of what Benedict Arnold does. He's a great American patriot until he has problems with the Continental Congress. And, it seems like a far fetched idea, but, if you're a judge, if you're a lawyer, you stand in the king's court, you defend the king's law. I mean, if you believe in law and order, which is what Henderson really pushed, right? He's bringing law and order to
mhm.
the wilderness. The monarchy, it doesn't sound half bad.
Well, anything else to add? I mean, this is pretty interesting. I'll add this too. If you think if it would have went forward with the Transylvania Company, it would have definitely been the 14th state, probably followed by Vermont. I guess would have been 15th. But then I think too, like you would see a lot more of these smaller states popping up. And because when you look at that map, the Transylvania Purchase is smaller than Kentucky, and it's kind of oddly shaped too. Um, but you would have a lot more of these. You would have a West Virginia pretty quickly, but
Yeah.
or in that area. You would have Ohio would not be the same. I just feel like that would be the case. Is you would have all these smaller pockets of colonies popping up that would want to become states quicker.
Well, you
Um,
see that with the nation of Franklin in Tennessee, where they tried, if
that's
anyone who's
right.
not familiar with them, they try to become their own country. So yeah, it may have set the tone that, hey, this is how you expand.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, but there's another one, Vandalia, that popped up, and somebody tried to become. They tried to make it a colony, and it was pretty much about more towards West Virginia and more up north in Pennsylvania.
Right.
That these people they wanted to become a colony, and Pennsylvania, though, shut it down, and Maryland shut it down. It was like, "No, this is still our land." I think Virginia shut it down too. It was like, "No, this is you're not your own colony." Um, but it came under 2 things, like, people wanted support, military support, to help battle off, the native, tribes and, that were, forcing people back east. Um and they wanted kind of representation of a voice in the government, and in most cases that was probably the outcome, is especially in Kentucky, is
Yeah,
and it eventually became its state. So um, very interesting,
it
very many
is.
possibilities.
And I hope people will
uh,
put more in the comments because I would love to know if there's anything we haven't thought of.
yeah, yeah, I mean there's so many, so many paths it could have went on, and I'm sure we're missing some of them. Yeah, you got to throw in Daniel Boone in there too. If things would have, stayed with Transylvania Company, does his path change? I would say yes, because
Mhm.
you're going to have. I don't know. Would settlement, you think, increase if it became its colony or a state? Would that make it? I mean, I would think that'd make
Ooh,
settlement increase to an extent. If it became a state, yes, but
yes.
if it's just a colony, I don't know.
Yeah, because you gotta if you remain just a colony, how are the people back home gonna feel about you moving westward? Are you viewed as a traitor? So, but yeah, if it's a
Yeah.
state, there's some legitimacy there.
Yeah, that's the thing. If they are a British colony and you just got 13 new American colonies, ah, it's gonna be tough. Where you gonna get your settlers from?
Right.
Because I mean, all the loyalists gonna go across the mountain, and maybe I don't know.
Now that's an interesting thought. If the war ends, instead of going to Canada, if Transylvania survives, does it become a loyalist colony?
Mm,
That's
ah,
that's that's worth pondering.
there you go. Well, yeah. Well, leave your comments. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Pretty interesting topic. I'm glad we discussed it. We'll get us another good what if here in another year or so.
Sounds good.
Um, again, be ready for another good full year of Kentucky history, and we got a lot coming the coming months. Um, some good Rock Castle history. I'll tease that a little bit, but other stuff too as well. Breckenridge County, some Grant County, and some Eastern Kentucky history as well. A lot of good stuff coming. So, and maybe some Washington County, right? Yeah.
We can do it. Absolutely.
uh, but plenty coming out here in the next year. So, David, thanks for joining us, and thank you all for listening. And we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.